Hello, in this Vodcast we're going to be looking at solid wastes. It's mostly garbage. Our learning target is to describe ways to dispose of solid waste. First of all, what is it? Well, according to the EPA, the United States produces 11 billion tons of solid waste annually. About half of the waste is agricultural, and more than one-third is mining. Industrial waste is about 400 million metric tons, of which 60 are hazardous. We see in the diagram over here is the municipal waste, and that's 200 million tons. And that's 2/3 of a ton per person. As you see here, the waste is mostly paper, food, yard waste, and plastics. There are three choices of what we can do with the waste. One is waste reduction, where we reduce the amount of waste. That's going to be covered in a separate podcast. Waste management, which is what this podcast is about, and there the impact of the environment is reduced by treating the waste to reduce toxicity, by burying it or burning it, or moving it elsewhere to be buried or burned. The third way is integrated waste management, which combines both waste reduction and waste management. It's not done all that much in the United States because 2/3 of the waste is either burned or buried, but there are improvements on bringing in waste management. For example, recently in New York City they made a decision to recycle plastics that have a number 5 on them. Now, for burying wastes, there are basically two ways that it's done. The first way is an open dump, and that you see pictured over here. And this is rare in developed countries. It's completely illegal in the United States, but it's common near cities in developing countries. There, wherever space is available, the garbage is dumped there. Usually it's in fields, it could be mines or quarries, which are basically rock mines where they dig up rocks to make buildings or roads or something like that. And these dumps are not covered, or they're not protected in any way that we're going to see in the sanitary landfills. These dumps are unsightly. They are breeding ground for pests such as rats and insects and seagulls. They pollute the air, and if they're in a bad location, they can also pollute the groundwater and the surface water. The second kind are sanitary landfills, and we'll be covering that in detail. Here's a diagram of a sanitary landfill. And the purpose of the sanitary landfill is to concentrate and contain the garbage without being a nuisance or a safety hazard or a health hazard. The refuse is dumped there, and then each day it's buried with soil. This will restrict access to the pests and also the amount of surface water that seeps into it, and will also keep gas from escaping. The gas is produced when some of the refuse decomposes, and the bacteria then produces such gases like methane, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas. With the site selection, the best place to put it are in arid regions because it's very little rainfall, which produces very little leachate. In humid areas, there should be impermeable clay or silt soils between it and the water table because that will keep the leachate from reaching the groundwater. And in reality, though it should not happen this way, these landfills tend to be located where residents have low socioeconomic status or they belong to a particular ethnic group. So there's a lot of environmental injustice involved in where to place these. And the reason why they're placed there is because these people don't have the political power or the political will in order to keep them from being placed where they live. Leachate is one of the biggest environmental problems with landfills. And when water seeps into the landfill, it will pick up things that can dissolve in it, and those toxins can then get into the groundwater. Additionally, pathogens can enter into it also, and those can go into the groundwater also and contaminate it. So how are these sanitary landfills kept sanitary? How are they kept from being a health hazard? Well, first we'll look at how the pollutants can leave the landfill. Gases such as methane, ammonia, and hydrogen sulfide are produced, and they will just simply enter the air. Heavy metals, such as from batteries, can enter the soil. Things that are soluble, like nitrates and sulfates, will be dissolved in the leachate. Runoff can also pick up this leachate, so that leachate could potentially contaminate the groundwater, and it could also potentially contaminate the surface water. Some heavy metals and toxins can enter the food chain because some plants are able to absorb certain heavy metals through their roots. And you'll see in another Vodcast how we are able to take advantage of that in order to clean up contaminated sites. And also the wind can transport some materials. And here's what we do with the leachate. First is the bottom of the landfill are lined with clay and plastic liners, and that keeps the leachate from leaving the landfill. Additionally, these liners are also put on top of the landfill when the landfill closes, so that will keep rainwater from getting into the landfill. Additionally, There are subsurface drainage pipes that collect the leachate, and then monitoring wells are put throughout the area around the landfills to monitor if the leachate is leaking. They can use systems to collect the methane gas, and methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. So at worst, it's just simply burnt and produces carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is a lot less harmful than methane in terms of climate change. And at best, they collect that methane and they use it to produce energy. In order to make sure that landfills are sanitary, legislation is needed in order to set standards and to enforce those standards. The law for this is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which was passed in 1980, and it set the safety landfills. And landfills that don't comply with these standards face closure. States have two choices as what to do. They can either comply with the federal standards, or they can make their own plan and seek EPA approval for those standards. The standards basically are not to be sited on hazardous land, and by hazardous that would be something like floodplains where a whole landfill could end up being flooded, and that would wash a lot of the refuse out of the landfill and throughout the environment. Unstable land, it could be something where under a lot of rainfall there could be like a mudslide or something like that that could compromise the whole landfill, or it could be an earthquake zone. Also, near airports is not a place to put it because the landfills attract a lot of birds, and the birds could collide with the airplanes. That would lead to an accident. Another standard is to have liners in the leachate collection system and also to monitor the groundwater. And they also need to make financial assurances to show that they are able to monitor the landfill for 30 years after the landfill closes. Here are the advantages and disadvantages for sanitary landfill. Advantages are there's no open burning, there's very little odor associated with it, and very little groundwater pollution. It's built quickly with low operating costs, and it can handle very large amounts of wastes. For example, in 3 World Trade Center buildings, the 2 big towers and number 7 were destroyed on 9/11. All that refuse that came from that were put into the Fresh-Killed landfill. Closed landfills can hold other purposes too. For example, in Croton, which is a little bit upstate on the Hudson River, the landfill there is now part of a park, and there is no landfill space shortage. Disadvantages. There's a lot of noise and there's a lot of traffic, and there's also dust that goes up into the air from all the traffic. There's air pollution, and the air pollution comes from toxic gases produced in the landfill itself and also from the trucks bringing the refuse. And unless the methane is collected, then it's released, and methane is a greenhouse gas. The refuse in the landfill is cut off from oxygen, and that means that there's not a lot of decomposition. And it's possible for you to go to a landfill and find hot dogs from 50 years ago that still look like hot dogs. They haven't decomposed yet. Now, what this means by output approach is that as more garbage is produced by a city, then what they would do is they would build more landfill. So there's nothing involved in discouraging waste production. Just as more waste is produced, we make more facilities in order to accept that waste. Even though sanitary landfills are built not to leak, leaks may eventually happen and contaminate the groundwater. The second way to get rid of garbage is incineration. What this does is it burns the waste at 1,650 degrees to 1,830 degrees Fahrenheit, and that basically will burn anything that can burn, and a lot of toxins that could be produced during an incomplete combustion are not produced because this is complete combustion, and all that's left is ash and non-combustibles. And it reduces the volume of the waste that goes onto a landfill by 75 to 95%. However, without a pollution control system, then quite a few pollutants, like dioxins and also heavy metals from batteries, can be released into the air. If you look at the diagram over here, this shows a waste-to-energy plant, and this does several things. First of all, it'll burn up the garbage and reduce the amount. It has a pollution control system. You can see by the numbers what's being reduced and where it's being reduced. In addition to that, it's a waste-to-energy plant. The heat that's produced is used to turn a generator and produce electricity. A typical plant produces 550 kilowatt hours per ton of waste. Advantages and disadvantages for incineration. First, the advantages. Trash volume is reduced. There's very little water pollution. The stuff that's hazardous tends to be concentrated for burial. The energy that's produced can be sold to the electric companies, and metals can be sold to recycling centers. And with modern controls, the amount of air pollution is reduced quite a bit. Disadvantages. They are expensive to build, and for that reason, not many incineration plants have been built, but quite a few have been expanded recently. It costs more to incinerate trash than it would to transport to a local landfill. NIMBY means not in my backyard. People do not want to have an incineration plant in their local community, so when there are plans to build an incineration plant, the people who are in the area generally will fight to prevent it from being built there. There's some air pollution from this, and also there are some carbon dioxide emissions. Some of these carbon dioxides will cause climate change, some won't. The ones that would be the ones that come from, say, burning wood. That's already old carbon that's in the cycle. The ones that would be greenhouse gas emissions would be, say, burning plastic, because the source of most plastics are petroleum, and that's coming from underground, so it's adding new carbon to the cycle. Older or poorly managed facilities release significant air pollution because their air pollution controls are not up to standards. And just like with the landfills, the output approach encourages waste production. And there's competition between these incineration plants and with recycling for combustibles like newspapers. Now we come to our concluding questions. Number 1, how much waste do people produce? Number 2, give an advantage and a disadvantage to sanitary landfills. And number 3, give an advantage and disadvantage to incineration. That concludes this podcast, and I'll see you in class tomorrow.